This is June 12th, 2022. I'm with Ajahn Punnadhammo. He's in Northern Ontario. He's the abbot of the Arrow River Forest Hermitage. And Pannobhasa, he's in South Carolina. And their books, you can find a link below this video, links to their locations and books. This is the Buddhist Cosmos. I know you have to hold it pretty low to the chest. Okay, the audience can read that.
Yeah.
And the long title there. And also Pannobhasa's got 3 books. This is Buddhist Ethics, Buddhist Practice, all available on Amazon. Yeah, and we're going to talk
about books too.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. I don't even have my books here, but I've got Freeing the Buddha and A Short Walk on an Ancient Path. Yeah, link below my videos. And we're going to talk about beings that are above the human level. So where should we begin? Ajahn put it down, but he's the expert on Theravada Buddhist cosmology. So would you like to start, Ajahn?
Well, we were going to define this discussion as to non-human beings that live on this earth that share this cosmological space with us.
Yes, I guess on this earth is limiting. We could talk about on this earth, but then there's the levels of the devas and
Right.
higher realms and outer space.
Yeah, I mean, we could go there too, but I think it's a broad enough topic just to stick with it.
Okay, we'll start down to earth.
Well, this what I would call this cosmological space, this Jampudipa, this earth we live on. Obviously, there's humans and animals, and animals are generally visible to us, although there's some that are so tiny that they're not. But there's also petas, ghosts, and various kinds of Bhuma devas, which are earthly devas. They don't live up in the heaven worlds. They mostly tree devas, and there's also all kinds of other places where they can live, including in cities, particularly above doorways. There's stories about devas living in clumps of grass and so on. So that there is a view of nature as being alive, full of all these devas, and also there are other classes of beings like Nagas, great serpent beings that particularly associated with waterways, rivers and lakes, oceans, and those devas that live in the ocean too, and Supanas, the great thunderbirds, as well as many other kinds of beings that don't really fall neatly into any classification scheme. Yakas, they're kind of ogres, demonic beings. There's Kanaras that are little people that live in the forest. Pamsukas that are kind of like goblins, little monstrous things.
Yeah. Kumbandas.
Kumbandas, yeah, they're curious creatures with enormous testicles.
Yeah.
There's no description I found of female Kumbandas, although it's mentioned. There's a female form of the word Kumbandi, and there's a couple of references to Kambandas and Kambandi, but there's no description of them. No idea of how they look. But the males have such enormous testicles that they can use them as seats, and they throw them over their shoulders to walk around.
Yeah, I think the origination of that was someone with elephantiasis of the scrotum, that there was a mention of that. And I mean, literally, it means what komba is like water pot, and anda is egg, which is like in Spanish, huevos is a euphemism for male body part.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I find fascinating about these different classes of beings is there's quite a lot of cross-cultural overlap with many of these. Like Nagas, giant serpent beings, we have dragons in Europe and in China, as well as the Nagas of India. They're all very similar, fire breathing. They're many kind of attributes, secondary attributes are cross-cultural, like fire breathing and shape shifting. And a lot of cultures have some sense of invisible beings living in the forest. The Native American lore is full of, different kinds of invisible beings that live in the forest. And Celtic countries, they have the Sith, the elves that live in the woodlands.
Yeah, in Southeast Asia, there's still plenty of belief in that sort of thing, especially in Burma. Like in Thailand or Burma, you can be driving down the highway and you'll see a big tree with a little shrine attached to the tree, and people will come and make offerings to the Ruka Deva that lives in the tree there. And then in Burma also there are beings called Asant, they're like guardians. They're like a kind of Deva, just one level above us, who are just guardians of a certain area. It can be like a cave or a waterfall or something, and there's taboos. You're not supposed to spit on the ground, or you're not supposed to pee on the ground in this area, and or else bad things will happen to you and so forth.
I want to mention the Nagas. Even in Western thought, like they're described as sea serpents, but in the Middle Ages, when European countries were sailing across the Atlantic, almost every country saw sea serpents in the Atlantic, like the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, up until World War I. And there was lore that you should not fire on one or you'll never make it to port. So this was known in Western thought for like hundreds of years.
Yeah, I think some of the legends, they do have mundane explanations. For example, with regard to Nagas, I mean, obviously, if you read the text, they were based on cobras, the cobra dragon. And I think that a worship of cobras went back in India a very long way. And a cobra is a really, it's an impressive being. A king cobra is 17, 18 feet long. And when it stands up, it's taller than a man with a hood this wide. And if it bites you, you die. And so I can imagine all sorts of mythology arising from that. And it could be that it was like Indian cobra worship that could have been the origination of Chinese belief in dragons and like West Asian belief in dragons. And the belief in dragons spread to Europe during the Crusades, or so I have read. So, I mean, I think there could be mundane explanations for some of these.
Yeah, that's a good theory. I want to mention the Bhumi Devas. When I was reading Ajahns book, The Buddhist Cosmos, it changed my daily habit. Because you quote in there, Ajahn, that the Buddha approved of the idea that you can make a food offering to a Bhumi Deva living in a tree and maybe, ask him for what you want or something like that. So I've been doing that since I read your book about 2 years ago. So when I make breakfast, put a bit out there, and I go, Bhumi Deva, Bhumi Deva, Bhumi Deva. And then sometimes the birds will come and get it later, but I intended it for the Bhumi Deva. So that's a regular practice because of your book, Ajahn.
Yeah, well, they still do that. I'm in Thailand. There's a common ceremony of the monks chanting paritas. It always starts with an invocation to the devas. And there's the idea of calling in all these beneficent beings to help with any, if somebody's starting a new business, they'll call, or they got a new house, or they just got married, they're starting on some new phase of life. They'll often call the monks in to do the ceremony, to chant, and it begins with calling the devas and then chanting the paritas.
I want to ask you, should I say anything when I put the food offering out there? Should I do a chant or just call them, or just look at the tree, or is there anything I should do?
I think just mentally, have an aspiration and, kind of attune yourself. I don't think you need to, verbalize anything.
Yeah, because sometimes my roommate's in the kitchen. It sounds weird, so I wouldn't do it while he's there.
There's Brian talking to his invisible friends again.
I want to mention shape shifting as well. I think you wrote in your book that's a hallmark of the Devas, particularly the Nagas. And there's a case in the Buddhist time of them shape shifting to human form, because we're talking about on this earth. So, some Devas could look like human beings walking the face of this earth. You want to talk about that, both of you?
Well, there's a really colorful story. There's a lot of colorful stories in Ajahn Mun's biography written by Ajahn Mahabua. And it was a story about a monk who in their circle who made a pilgrimage to India overland, walking through Burma. And on the way back, World War II broke out, and Burma and Thailand were on opposite sides. So he had to be very careful, and he was taking like back trails rather than go through towns and villages. And he was fainting from hunger, and he sat down under a tree in a forested area, thinking he was done for. He's got no food. He hasn't eaten in a few days, and he's too tired to move. And he saw a man dressed in, as he described it, it looked like a princely or noble dress common in Burma in the 18th century, walk out from behind a tree, like this richly dressed man carrying a silver platter full of food, offered it to the monk, and then walked back behind the tree and never seen again.
Yeah, that's the way the Burmese represent devas, is wearing like court costumes from the days of the Burmese kings.
Yeah, yeah.
So the devas have been on time.
Yeah, the Burmese, I mean, the religion they had before they converted to Buddhism is called the Nat Cult. It's the Burmese word for deva is Nat, which comes from the Pali word Nata, like Lord, like Anatam Indika is Nata, or Jagannatha, Juggernaut. But for them, they were worshiping, it was like people who had died a violent death were considered more likely to be powerful spirits after they died. And some of them would be essentially, low-level devas. And so when they converted to Buddhism, they just took Saka, king of gods, and put him at the head of their pantheon. And they still follow these other beings.
Yeah, I think Thailand's kind of some similar roots, like the spirit worship that still goes on today, but it was pre-Buddhist. There's something I read in a book about Thai history once. It's kind of horrendous. In the Sukhothai period, when they were nominally Buddhist, but they were still very much influenced by the shamanistic traditions. When the king built some new building, a new palace or whatever he was building, they would, for the four corner posts, they would put a pregnant woman in the hole and then drop the post on top of her.
Yeah, and the Burmese did something similar.
And the theory was that if the woman and the unborn child died together instantaneously, it'd make a very powerful spirit that would then live in the pillar of the building and protect it.
Yeah, in fact, that was one reason why the British conquered what remained of the Burmese Empire, or they used that for propaganda purposes, where it was common practice in Burma for a fortune teller to tell the king that he had to move the capital. It was like all the juju had been used up in this area. They had to move the capital to another place. And it happened several times in Burmese history. It happened just recently also. And the king had enough sense to realize that he couldn't afford it. And so they were going to bury it was like 50 people alive around the outside of the palace walls. And people caught wind of that, and it caused like an exodus of people from Burmese Upper Burma into British Southern Burma. And probably the British really didn't care all that much, but they used that as sensationalist propaganda to justify invading Upper Burma.
I think of that example you mentioned, both of you, that could actually be true with the pregnant woman, the baby, and killing them. That might actually be true. I remember when I lived in Chiang Mai, Thailand, mid-'80s, my Thai wife and I, we knew the managers of DK Books, and they described how they had a miscarriage, a stillborn baby miscarriage. So they kept it in a bottle, and the baby wants to help them. So they said, it's really good for business in the bookstore. It's really good for business. So they had the baby in a bottle there in the bookstore, and they would chant or talk to the baby and the spirit of the baby. And I said, explain, of course, from Buddhist, hey, that's not right. You're getting the spirit latched onto you for your personal gain, but that's not right. But this is something Thais do. I witnessed that.
Yeah.
It's certainly not Buddhist, but so I think that could actually be true, that whole idea with the posts. Like, why do they do it? Maybe it has some efficacy. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, to some degree, it's possible. To another degree, it could just be like a placebo effect, where if you believe that something is going to work, it can have some sort of effect.
Also, it occurred to me when I read that the first time is that why would this spirit want to defend and protect the building? You think they would be sort of like,
yeah,
a little bit ticked off at what would have been done to them.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. Good point.
Yeah. So there is like, I mean, you can sort of divide these invisible beings, these invisible earthbound beings into different groups, right? You've got essentially ghosts or petas, and then you've got like the level just above us with the level of the four kings, which is, it's got earthbound deities, like the tree dwelling deities and so forth. And also I assume yakas and so forth would be considered members of that group.
Well, they're subject. Yakas are not considered devas, but they are subject to one of the four great kings, Wisawana. They're all considered to be his subjects. And
which level do they belong to then? Which of the 31 planes of existence?
Yeah, this is the thing. They don't really classify easily. There's a lot of these beings that really don't fit into the classification scheme.
I think some of the meanings have changed over time, though. Like, for example, in some of the suttas, Saka, the king of gods, is called Yaka. The Buddha himself is called Yaka at least once.
Well, Yaka is used generically just to mean a being.
Yeah, or a spirit or something like that.
A spirit being, like a non-human being.
It's
very general term.
I have a theory about yakas and how they originated, in that when you had the Vedic Sanskrit Indo-Europeans invading India, they already had their own pantheon, but the people that were already living there had their pantheon also. And the Indo-Aryans, they didn't want to put them at the same level as their own pantheon, but they weren't going to completely say, no, they don't exist at all. So they had to sort of fit them into a slightly lower position than their own devas.
That could be that they, because that's the sort of thing the Christians did with the pagan gods, right? They saw them as devils.
Yeah. They didn't say they didn't exist. They just said that they were devils, essentially.
Oh.
I want to ask Ajahn, both of you, about the Nagas shape-shifting. Your book actually changed my thinking. I used to take, say, the view of, David Icke's famous book, The Biggest Secret, 1999, popularized the idea of the reptilians, and that they shape-shift, and prominent figures in the political world could be reptilians in human form. And I believe that. I bet some people personally have had experiences of seeing eyes shift. But I think your book convinced me in your teachings that these are actually not Nagas. This is something else. So reptilians are physical beings, where Nagas are devas, spirit-like beings. But I think some aliens are actually walking among us. Like Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, was in Vancouver. Met a friend of mine, John Theobald. He had a one-on-one little meeting. He said, so Edgar, do you think the aliens are here? And Edgar Mitchell said, they're walking among us. So it's a common view within the ufology community that, and probably American intelligence knows there's some that could be walking up. Various types of aliens can take on human form, and examples of this. And Ajahn, I should tell the audience, you did a video on UFOs and aliens. That was very good. And you commented a bit about UFOs and aliens. I've always trying to combine the idea of Buddhist devas, who are spirit-like, versus aliens are physical. And then this whole interdimensional aspect in ufology. Many people feel they're both physical and interdimensional, which is very much like Buddhist cosmology. I'm always thinking, you're the monk who wrote the book, and you could really do a number on commenting on the whole UFO community, that Buddhism has something to say about this, and the UFO community largely ignores Buddhism,
Yeah, well, there's the whole, first, just a couple of things I'd like to say here. Well, one is this whole issue of Nagas and reptilians. I think we've talked about this before, that I don't really see the reptilian model as the same as Nagas, because I don't find anywhere Nagas in the traditional literature, Nagas attempting to control humans or take over human society. And, you know, they really don't want much to do with us. So, you know, I think that seems to be a major difference. The other thing is about UFOs. There's certainly some very provocative overlaps in terms of, first of all, the Vimanas, that the heavenly vehicles or palaces of the gods that move through space. And that is the Vimanas is a concept that actually goes way back before Buddhism. This is a Vedic thing, you know. And I heard somebody recently on a YouTube video talking about the Vedic Vimanas, that there's apparently a text. I don't know if it's been translated, but there's apparently a text that reads like a flight manual describing how Vimanas operate. It's a Sanskrit text. So there's that. But I think if you really wanted to explore an extraterrestrial angle of that, you'd have to go to the pre-Buddhist literature.
Yeah, I think a lot of what are called aliens now could have been called, you know, gods or elves or fairies or that sort of thing in a previous age, when you have to explain what you don't understand in accordance with what you do understand. And right now we're living in a technological age, and so we interpret it technologically. And in the past, I mean, elves and leprechauns and the little people that lived in the forests and so forth, they did have a certain amount of overlap with what descriptions of them today. There
certainly is this across, like I said, across all human cultures, there's always been you know, non-human entities that are described as, and often very similar terms of living, particularly in forests. The other Buddhist text that has some that I think would be of interest to anyone interested in UFOs is the description of the wheel of the wheel turning monarch. And I translated that in my book. I don't think that's ever been translated before. It's a long passage from the Tikka, from the sub-commentary.
Because I read it, I was really impressed with that. You know, I didn't know you were the one that translated. It wasn't in English before. I never knew that. That's great.
No, it's in very great detail, and it strikes one as someone trying to describe something that they actually saw, but that's quite outside of their experience. And it sounds very mechanical, and you know, and it's in an incredible amount of detail.
There is one thing I'd like to bring up that does have something to do with what we're talking about. And I read a book long ago about near-death experiences, and usually they follow a similar pattern. You know, they rise up and they see their body down below, possibly with paramedics working on them. And then they reach the bright light, and they go into the bright light they enter this other realm where there's usually some spirit guide there who, you know, tells them, you know, to review their past life, or, you know, review their life, and, you know, they did this wrong and that wrong, but they have to go back because they're not finished yet, this sort of thing. And there was one case history where his spirit was detached from the body. He was clinically dead for a short time, and his spirit was just sort of making a tour of the city around the hospital, and he could see that everybody walking down the sidewalk had a kind of funnel of energy kind of coming out of their head, and all around them would be clustered these disembodied spirits trying to influence them. And I mean, there's really not much of that in Buddhism. In like the New Testament, you know, it's like practically everybody had, you know, evil spirits, you know, harassing them or possessing them or so forth. And it does seem interesting to me that you could have really just beings that don't have a body, but like they want to have some kind of presence in this world. And so their only way they can cause anything physical to happen is by influencing physical beings.
Yeah, I think this is this is actually a very important thing you're touching on, and this is kind of a danger with a lot of the channeling stuff that people are being manipulated by beings, you know, that they really don't know what they're getting into. There was a book written some years ago called the title of the book was Hungry Ghosts, and it was all about channeling. The guy who wrote it was a journalist who started out with the view that it was all fake, that it's all just a scam. And he started investigating different channelers, and he said, yeah, a lot of them are scams, but there's a significant number that there's something else going on there. And some of the stories he told, you know, he said, yeah, there are contacting beings, but don't trust these beings. And he told this one story about a spirit that was being summoned who claimed to have been an American World War II fighter pilot who was shot down. And as an investigative journalist, he wanted to, you know, kind of follow this up. So he got, you know, he kind of pressed everyone else at the seance was just like really, you know, overawed by this, but he, you know, pressed with questions like, what unit were you with? Where was your air base? And what was your name? And all this stuff, right? And he got all this information down, and he went to a veterans society, you know, through a veterans society, he located other members of that squadron that were still surviving, and he interviewed them. And the first thing he found out was that there was never any member of that squadron by that name. But he also, this spirit had told some kind of anecdotes that things that only the members of the squadron would know, like pranks that went on in the barracks or something like that. And they were true stories, but they didn't know who this guy was. And so he went back to the spirit and challenged him. And the spirit said, you don't expect me to tell you the whole truth, do you?
Wow.
Yeah, well, that's one reason why there's somewhat like a subhuman realm, you know, if you consider them to be ghosts.
Yeah, it's the ghost realm, right? But I call it the ghost realm, right?
Yeah, and it's a characteristic of Petas, you know, that they want to experience fleshy existence, but they can't. So this is their suffering. You know, they can't properly eat or drink or anything. So if they can possess a human, manipulate a human, then they're getting some taste of fleshy existence again.
Yeah. I have a question about Petas. Is that, do they have their own realm, or do they necessarily exist, you know, on Earth or near Earth? Would they have like, you know, there could be some Petas that are just like off on their own, in their own world or some such?
They're both. They're Petas that live amongst us, you know. Usually they hang around places where they lived as humans. I see it as kind of like an aborted death process. They can't let go of their human existence, but they can't really have it anymore, so they kind of hang around.
Yeah, some of them don't even know that they're dead.
Right. But there are kind of higher grade of Petas that live in a kind of a realm that's adjacent to us. It's sort of what you could call like a slightly different frequency. You know, they're just outside of our.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that in Buddhism, it's like a continuum. It's like a spectrum where the highest ghost and the lowest god are just contiguous.
Yeah.
Like in the Peta Watu, you've got someone who lives like a god. You know, they're a being that's like a Bhumi Deva, but they had this one bad action in a previous life that causes them to have this one bad thing that keeps them sort of below Deva level.
Yeah, and I think I know what story you're referring to. That in the course of that story, that same being is referred to as a Peta, as a Yaka, and as a Dewa in different senses. So there's kind of a gray area. You know, the highest Petas and the lowest Dewas kind of overlap.
Yeah.
So, Ajahn,
And like I was saying earlier, there are, like, in some cultures, like Burmese culture, there's just absolutely no doubt. For example, when Burmese monks will lead, sending metta, that's a fairly common thing for monks to do, is lead the group. They get invited to a house, and after the sermon, there's chanting, and then they might be, like doing a guided metta meditation where they're saying, send metta. And on the list of all the beings, you've got the Ko-Samtnat, which is like your personal, like your guardian spirit, essentially. You got the deva that's guarding your house, the deva that's guarding your neighborhood, the deva that's guarding your town, the deva that's guarding the country, the deva that's guarding the world.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So you have a personal one, a deva guarding you, you're saying?
Yeah, it's like the guardian spirit in sort of Western belief.
Is that a Buddhist belief, or is it a Burmese cultural folk belief, or is it?
I haven't read anything about it in the text, so maybe it's just a Burmese culture.
Yeah, I think it must be strictly Burmese, because I haven't seen it in the literature, and I also I'm not familiar with that concept in Thailand. So yeah, it's strictly a Burmese thing.
Yeah, my father was a hypnotist and hypnotized some spirit mediums. They're called channelers now, or maybe they've moved on to a different name. And,
now they call them downloads. You receive downloads. That's the new word. At least in ufology, they call them downloads.
So my father claimed that his guardian spirit was a dead Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Tay Sing, and so he learned a lot of his Buddhism from this woman in a trance. Yeah, was supposedly channeling this dead Vietnamese monk.
It's not the one on your website that self.
No, not that
one. Actually, I want to follow up. You said the ancient Vedas have like a text on operator's manual for these vimanas. I know amongst contactees or experiencers of the aliens, like the Greys, many claim they've been on the craft and they're giving an opportunity to fly the craft. Like they put their hands on the console, and it's the quality of consciousness. They fly with their consciousness. And they've said, if you don't have a certain level of consciousness, like spiritual development, then you can't connect with the craft. The craft itself is conscious. It's like an extension of the body. So that's kind of a good sign. Like if you don't have the spiritual qualities, you can't do it. And I was reading the Atanata Protection Sutta. There's a line from the Buddha. He says, cars fit for gods they have as well. So that seems to be an indication of the deva and the vehicle, the car that he's in. It's like a distinguishing too. It's almost like you become the UFO, or you become one with it. Yeah, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that makes me think about real aliens and real craft buzzing around.
Yeah, well, I know that some people have put forward this analogy of the devas in their Vamanas are actually visitors from other planets, or perhaps of other dimensions. And it's the way that the ancient Buddhists understood it, was that the Vamanas were the dwelling places of the gods. And so they're translated, if in English translation, it's usually translated as mansions, but they're really mobile, because they travel in their Vamana. And sometimes they come to Earth to visit the Buddha, for example, in their Vamana. And they can, move around as they will with the Vamana through space. There's no description in the Buddhist literature about how that works. It's kind of like the supernormal or magical power of the devas.
So that can explain, like, some UFOs are cylindrical shaped, some are large, some describe city-sized kind of motherships parked beyond the atmosphere. So that's describing like a craft that they come in.
Yeah, yeah, you could call it a craft. I mean, sometimes they've been called chariots in some of the translations, but
yeah, I think Saka has a charioteer and a chariot.
Yeah, but there's a different word that's used. That's Sata.
Yeah,
he has a chariot with 100 horses pulling it, and charioteer Matali. but the Wamanas has sometimes been translated as chariot as well, because they are mobile, and they can travel through space in their Wamana.
But by space, that means like outer space. So we're talking about like a UFO then, right? It could be so.
Well, it could be. I mean,
Could be.
I'm a little bit reluctant to push the analogy too far, as I really not I don't see the ancient Indians having that concept of beings from other worlds coming to Earth in ships. It was kind of incidental when they visited the Earth. It would be like to see the Buddha. It would be a very rare incidental thing.
Oh,
It would move around within their own realm, from one place to another with their Vamanas. They take their whole Vamana to go to the Nandana Grove and enjoy the pleasures of the grove. Without, this is like a mobile home, just just move your whole
yeah.
home. Yeah.
Yeah. So the implication is that devas are pretty much restricted to their own world system. They're not traveling to other world systems. Although, like Brahmas, who are like overlords of many world systems, presumably would be moving from one world system to the next, just keeping an eye on things or whatever.
Well, I think they can do that from their own seat, but there are stories about devas going from one realm to another, but it seems to be in unusual circumstances, like often involving the Buddha. Like when the Buddha taught in Tawatingsa heaven, his mother had been reborn as a deva into Shita heaven, which is 2 heavens above, and she came down to listen to his preaching. And there's a sutta in the Digha Nikaya about Brahma manifesting to the gods in Tawatingsa heaven to have a discussion with them. An interesting detail of that is that when he first appears, all they see is a brilliant light. And then he has to deliberately create a coarse form. They can't see him in his natural form. He has to create a coarse form for them to be able to see him, so that any beings on a lower level cannot normally perceive beings on a higher level.
Yeah. So I think to some degree, even like ghosts, in many cases anyway, cannot see humans.
I want to relate that to the higher realm beings. Like the gray aliens have also been described as transferring into light beings or orbs. People have seen them become light beings, and even Richard Dolan, he's perhaps the most famous UFO historian, quite evidence-based. He says that the mantis aliens could be the highest intelligence that humanity has yet encountered. It's called the mantis because it looks similar to a praying mantis, but what's different about the mantis, they explain that they don't have any idea of an origination planet, whereas the grays may have come from Zeta Reticuli or particular planets. But they say it's something that humans can't understand. So I thought of the Brahma realm, like like you said, from the seat of Brahma, he can encompass like 1,000 world system. And the mantids are supposedly bring life from planet to planet, and they're the architects which give the instructions to the grays to work things out, but they can basically see life kind of like the role of God from planet to planet. So they're dealing with this large system beyond one solar system with many solar systems. So I theorize, could the mantis be a Brahmin or something pretty high up?
That does sound like the Brahmins, if they have an oversight of many world systems.
Yeah.
Characteristic of the Brahmas.
Yeah, that's what people have described on craft. They see grays, tall grays, ancient grays, and the mantis are more rare because like you don't see the boss as much as the workers. You see the much more grays. So they're higher up. They're always regarded as the highest. They're always the boss. They're always the highest in echelon. So I really thought because I've always thought, could Buddhist cosmology, with the sophistication of cosmology, talking about the devas, levels of heaven, the Brahmas, the levels of the Brahma realm, could we give some commentary on today ufology, which is kind of coming out more, So I think Buddhism has a lot to offer there. And you're the monk, Ajahn. You're the monk to talk about it.
It comes down to, human beings at whatever period of history we're living in. We're trying to describe the greater universe, and we create models. And the model is not the actual universe. The universe is as it actually is beyond our comprehension. But we create models to try and fit things in and explain things. And there will be, between different models, there'll be some overlap and there'll be some difference. Now, I put it at the end of my book, in an afterword, I compared the cosmology of ancient India, the Buddhist cosmology, with modern scientific cosmology and medieval Aristotelian cosmology.
Yeah.
That comparison to me is quite revealing, that there's a similarity of spirit between the modern and the Buddhist one, and the medieval one is the odd one out. But there's quite a bit of difference in details. Like in both the modern and the Indian cosmology, there's a multitude, even an infinite number of world systems inhabited by beings. But in the Buddhist cosmology is different than the modern one, because those are never associated with the stars. There's never a sense of them being planets going around stars. The stars are not very well explained at all. And it seemed to me that this was a curiosity, a difference between the Indian and the Greek mind. That the Greeks developed their cosmology, which carries on to modern times in the same tradition. They developed their cosmology by looking at the sky and trying to figure out the movement of the bodies. Whereas that was incidental to the Indians. They were interested in levels of consciousness. And they created a cosmology that would accommodate the different levels of consciousness.
Wow. I should mention ufology. Grant Cameron, he comes from close to Winnipeg, Canada's most famous ufologist. He says it's all about consciousness. UFOs and the ET Connect, it's all about consciousness. He's back in 1975, he was studying this case of Red Charlie in Winnipeg, a big sighting at that time. And he was a nuts and bolts guy, about UFOs. Now he says it's actually all about the experiencers and it's about consciousness. So we're really talking about kind of the nature reality. Like we said, like we're trying to develop models of reality. We're really kind of discussing what is the nature of the universe, what is the nature of reality itself.
Yes.
And to some degree, we are enslaved to our cultural conditioning and have to interpret things in accordance with our culture, unless we're really weird. And I suppose even Tawatimsa would be considered on this earth if it's at the top of Mount Meru.
Yeah. The first two Dewa realms, the realm of the four great kings and Tawatimsa, are in a sense terrestrial Dewas, and that's separate from the higher four that are beyond. There's no physical connection with the earth at all, and it's a interesting point and a significant point that Tawatimsa is the last realm where there's any conflict. They're still fighting with the Asuras. And
That's one classification of being we haven't mentioned yet, who I assume technically would be earthbound, at least to some degree. At least there's some in space, like Rahu. But it seems like the Buddhists, it's sort of like almost anachronistic by the time Buddhism came along. They really didn't have much, the Asuras don't get a whole lot of mention, considering that they're one of the 31 planes of existence. They're essentially like the Titans in Greek mythology. And it may go back to the same prehistoric legends.
I think so. That there's, all like the Greeks, the Indians, and the Norse, they all come from the same Indo-Aryan root, right? There's a root culture of the Aryans that spread out all over Eurasia, and there's some real similarities in their mythologies and cosmology. They all have some version of this primal fight between gods and anti-gods, and the theme is always that the anti-gods, the asuras or the titans or the storm giants, they kind of came first. They were sort of the more primordial level, and then a higher, more refined type of conscious beings arose, the gods or the devas, that overthrew the rule of the previous ones and took over.
Yeah. I think my mundane explanation for that would be there could have been a kind of religious conflict between two tribes or something, whose pantheon is going to take precedence or something like that. And it got turned into the actual gods themselves fighting. And apparently the Persians had it so that the Asuras came out on top. Like their main god for the Zoroastrians is Ahura Mazda, which is Asura in Sanskrit. Ahura is,
the devas and asuras are on opposite sides in Persia and India.
I didn't know that. So Pannobhasa, is this a good asura or a bad asura in Zoroastrianism?
Well, he's their god of light and goodness. So
is that like Lucifer? Some people say, they interpret Lucifer as a good being, a light being,
I think the Sufis had him as a kind of fall guy where he was he refused to bow down to Adam just out of respect for God. He would only bow down to God, and God just sort of tricked him into becoming Satan, just because they needed a villain or something.
I think the discussion of the very nature of reality, this is something people can't handle. I think the governments don't want full UFO disclosure because, people can't handle the truth. And I think from what I've researched, the aliens are saying the same thing. It's got to go slow. It's got to go gradual. People can't handle the truth. So that seems to be why it's been going gradually since like 1947 or whenever,
Yeah, well, I mean, we're never really going to know the truth unless we become fully enlightened. Because all we know is mostly conventional truth, which is not really truth at all. It's kind of, maybe it has some correlation with truth, but we're just dealing with symbols and words and so forth, which is radically different from the reality we're trying to understand.
Exactly. That's why I like to talk about these different cosmologies as models, even including the scientific modern one. It's a model.
I think scientific models, science itself is going to be eventually replaced by something else. Or at least, it might not be completely replaced, just as Christianity, which was the world, our explanation of reality didn't get completely replaced, but still, there's going to be something, that's going to, in a way, take its place as our model for understanding reality.
I think materialism that much of modern science is kind of founded on, I think that will be transcended. That'll pass away. And you can see that happening with beginning in the 20th century with quantum mechanics, that the pure materialist paradigm is shaken up. It doesn't really work anymore.
Yeah, I think that kind of arose with the revolution around 1780s, the Industrial Revolution, when we actually, even European society was more into other realms of existence, even prior to the Industrial Revolution. Then we became kind of more materialistic. So it's really just a short period of time, a few centuries, and now we're losing that materialistic thinking again.
There's an essay written by a Christian talking about angels, that he made a very provocative kind of view, put forward a very provocative kind of view there. It's kind of intriguing. He said that if you compare medieval art and Renaissance and later art, there's obviously a change in the development of perspective. And he said that what happened around the 1400s was there was a major shift in human consciousness, and that before that, human beings could easily see into these other realms, like angels, or we would say devas. These beings were more accessible to them. But there was a necessary evolution in human consciousness. We needed to master the material world. We had to go through a phase of mastering the material world. So our consciousness became realigned. And he said that that perspective was not really invented in the 1400s. It was just, that was just how they saw things. Like previously, they didn't. Their view of the material world was more primitive, was more distorted.
Wow.
It also
that's
seemed
interesting.
Yeah.
But then they collapsed into the material realm, and they got a more refined view of the material realm, but they lost the spiritual realm. And he hopes that in the future we'll go through another phase where we integrate both.
That reminds me of Francis Bacon. I think he said he had to call upon the muse before he can write. So that was the thinking of those days. You have to call upon the muse, the spirit, the David to come in you. And it's also interesting. The printing press was invented in the 1440s, perhaps the greatest invention in history. You know, the internet is like the printing press of the day. So maybe that got us spreads more education. Maybe it brought us more down to earth or something.
Yeah, I do have a theory that's closely related to what the Ajahn was just mentioning, where like children and people from like pre-technological societies, a few of which still exist, they have more of a fuzzy bandwidth that they're receptive to. Whereas if you grow up in a civilized technological society, you've got to really have a sharp focus on this one bandwidth of reality, just so you can get everything precise and get all the rules down and everything. And yeah, I think it's not necessarily the way it works. So there have been like really advanced beings who just have an access to various bandwidths. It's like some Hindu yogis, it's like they can change the channels. It's like we're like a radio that's like locked into one frequency. But the more advanced you get, the more frequencies you have access to, maybe. And you can even change the channels to some degree and have access to different realms and so forth.
Yeah, I could see that. That's a strong analogy. Yeah, that kind of tuning in. I'm always a little leery of using the word frequency in this context, although I see the point of it, because it's, to my mind, it's like I have a background as an electronic technician, and I have a certain view of what a frequency is that it's more electromagnetic. But yeah, but I see basically that's a very strong analogy, like tuning into a different bandwidth and experiencing.
Yeah, it's like in Buddhism they talk about subtle matter, and just beings can be right here and we can't see them.
Yes,
just because they're at a different vibrational rate or different level of subtlety or whatever. That's a common theme, that the Brahmas want to manifest to the Devas. They have to deliberately assume a coarse body, and if the Devas want to manifest to humans, they have to assume a coarser body, and they've got that power, the shape-shifting power, to make a coarse body. There was a Brahma who was one of the Buddhist students who died and was reborn as a Brahma, and he came back to see the Buddha, and he was just like a brand new Brahma. He didn't know the ropes yet, and he appeared before the Buddha, but like a human form, but he immediately began sinking into the earth. And the Buddha says, you're not going to be able to stand on the ground here unless you assume a coarser form.
Oh, wow. Wow.
That's interesting.
Wow. It's cosmology that first brought me to Buddhism. My very first lesson was Monday, January 14th, 1991 at the Vancouver Shambhala Center. It was the beginning of a 6-week course on Buddhist cosmology. And I was smitten right away. I thought, Buddhism, this is it for me. And I got right into it, And then 2 years later, I was living in Thailand, just studying the Devas. A lot of people are just drawn to meditation, structure reduction, meditation, breath meditation. But I was really into cosmology. It's really stuck with me. I've always had a big interest in it. It still does. It's really that interest. Okay. Well, thank you. I guess we can dedicate some merit to the Devas. Hope they're watching this video. Maybe they'll learn some Dhamma. So thank you for joining me, Ajahn, Pannobhasa.